think we're going to go ahead and start. We've got a double header today, so we hope that you will enjoy the presentation you're about to see or hear. And also there's another presentation at 6:30, Tony Orsler as part of the Plasma series. My name is Terry Reeve. I'm faculty in the Department of Media Study, and I'm delighted today to be presenting the last in the Landscape Across the Disciplines Research Workshop lecture series that was co-sponsored by the Humanities Institute and the Department of Media Study for this event and for the spring events, in fact. So Media Study has been very active in promoting an interdisciplinary exchange around media in all different modes and formats. Today's guest, Ernst Karel, who I'm delighted to introduce, and also to host. It was a long time coming. We've been working away at this and trying to find a good date for over 9 months. So this is a big pleasure for me. Ernst Karel's multidimensional audio work includes electroacoustic improvisation and composition, location recording, sound for nonfiction film, and solo and collaborative sound installations. Using analog electronics and location recordings, either separately or in combination, Karel creates audio pieces that move between the abstract and the documentary. Recent installations include the ongoing project Hourly Directional Sound Recordings with Helen Mira, instantiations of which have been exhibited in the 2012 Sao Paulo Biennale and at the MIT List Visual Arts Center. Together with Pavel Wojciasek and Toby Kim Lee, he made Single Stream, first as a large-scale video and 4-channel audio installation for the Museum of the Moving Image in Queens, New York, and then as a cinematic work with 5.1 sound, which premiered in March at the 52nd Ann Arbor Film Festival. Current sound projects also include the long-running electroacoustic duo EKG and the location recording collective the New England Phonographers Union. Films for which Karel has edited and mixed sound include Sweetgrass, Foreign Parts, Leviathan, Human, and Manakamana. His most recent albums, composed with location recordings, are Materials Recovery Facility in 2012, Swiss Mountain Transport Systems in 2011, and Herd Laboratories 2010. His multi-channel audio work was also included in the 2014 Whitney Biennial, along with broader works from the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab, where he is a member and also a lecturer in anthropology. And he teaches a course in sonic ethnography, which has been a real inspiration to me, and some of my students I know from last semester are here today in the long-awaited presentation. So without further ado, please help me welcome Ernst Karel.
Gosh, thanks very much, very kind. And thanks a lot for having me. So we're gonna start by listening to a piece. It's a version of, Terry mentioned this project, Swiss Mountain Transport Systems, it was published as a CD in one form, but I've also made a couple of other iterations of it. One in collaboration with Helen Mira, who was also mentioned I have collaborated with on audio projects in the past, as an 8-channel piece, and then later as a 17-channel piece. And then I was so fond of the material that I ended up making this version that we're going to listen to today, which is I call the radio version, 5.1 mix. So it's as if we're listening to the radio, but we have the benefit of a cinematic sound system here. The project started a few years ago when we were living in Basel, Switzerland I was there for just part of the year. Helen was there on residency for the whole year. And her practice, she's a visual artist, and her practice had just shifted at that point from a kind of studio-based practice of making work inside to a practice which is based on walking. And she's making work through walking in different ways. And that started I guess it was 2008. And we were looking at maps of Switzerland and deciding different places to walk, and in this case it was collecting relatively large rocks from different places in the Swiss mountains. And so we were kind of looking at the map and finding locating, which kinds of geologic features existed in which mountain ranges and which parts of Switzerland, and then taking advantage of the incredible transportation network which exists in that country to be able to go from where we were living in Basel to almost any part of Switzerland within a couple of hours. I mean, it's not a very big, I guess the farthest places are more than that, but we could easily go to some tiny village in the middle of a valley within an hour or two from Basel, and then take, as it turns out, there's this, the network of transportation is not just trains that connect cities and villages, but Switzerland, of course, extends vertically, as we're all aware. And that vertical dimension is used not just for pleasure activities like skiing and hiking, but is settled. There's a whole civilization which is built up into the mountains, little villages, towns, and so forth. And the way that people get to and from their homes and workplaces these days is via a network of what I've called mountain transport systems, including gondolas, funiculars, or cogwheel railways. Materials are moved around by helicopter, if construction materials are needed, so these kinds of ways of adapting to living in a mountainous landscape. And it became clear as soon as we started doing this that, we got into one of these gondolas, that not only is it a kind of amazing way to experience a landscape by moving through it and seeing it from either the heights or from a moving railway or whatever it is, but it's an incredible sonic experience. Especially if we take the case of gondolas, so these are 4 or 6 person little boxes, with windows all around, windows open, and so this was summer or fall. It's not a winter skiing kind of situation. So the windows are open and wind is blowing past the windows, and you're really experiencing not just it's a different way of sort of mediating with the environment than, say, photography would be. You can take a snapshot of a landscape and pretend that there was such a moment in time that once existed. But as we know, landscapes, the world around us exists and changes in time. And so sound recording is, I think, uniquely suited, maybe even more so than sound with video or film, to immerse us in, to force us to reckon with the passing of time in a really direct way, I think. So I'm happy to present this as part of this landscape series because I think it's the project is really sort of plays on not only this experience of time, but a sense of a sort of social geography, which is built, the way the way I'm stumbling. Take a deep breath. This is what happens when one attempts to speak in front of other human beings. But yeah, we can talk more afterwards maybe about what is the experience of just listening when it's divorced from visual media. We're often experiencing things both through our eyes and our ears, obviously, but of course all the senses are intertwined, and we experience things with all of our senses at once. And so it's an interesting experiment to see what happens when that's pared down and we're listening only. We're not seeing anything but only listening, and the kinds of what becomes recognizable, what is no longer recognizable, whether it matters whether things are recognizable, and what are those boundaries between an aesthetic experience and an experience of some kind of representation, and so on. So I think that's all I'll say for now, unless there's anything else I should say before we start. Can you think of anything?
Well, can I ask a question early on?
Sure.
Just the privilege of being
Yeah.
introducer. I kind of forgot to mention that you have a PhD in anthropology.
Uh-huh.
And so I think your approach to ethnography might be useful to provide just a context for people to understand.
Mm-hmm.
It's very new. The sonic ethnography approach, I think, is
Mm-hmm.
worth expanding.
Yeah, so as Terry mentioned, right now I'm teaching a class called Sonic Ethnography, and through the Sensory Ethnography Lab at Harvard. And for me, it's a bit of an experiment. I don't think that there is something that we can necessarily call sonic ethnography. It builds, of course. I mean, the idea of documentary sound at all. If we're talking about sound that's not rooted in language, which we're of course familiar with, every kind of radio documentary we hear is centered on a voice kind of communicating information to us in a language that we can understand, or music. And obviously these are the two big kind of streams of field recording or documentary sound. When we don't have either music or speech to rely on, let's see, how do I want to frame this? I mean, this idea of doing documentary audio or audio, maybe we can talk about two sort of precursors to it. One would be, or historical precedents, or historical streams, or pillars, or whatever we might want to say, or backgrounds. One would be documentary practices, nonfiction approaches such as documentary film video is the main one. Another might be electroacoustic music, which, with its roots in, specifically with its roots in musique concrète, this idea of recording actual sounds and taking those sounds to build musical compositions. So it has roots in the real world, but the goal is not necessarily, and in some cases the goal is quite opposed to the idea of actually representing something in the world. So it's taking something from the world in order to do something that's not of the world. The idea of making sound pieces that don't necessarily rely on music or on speech is kind of a historically recent, I think, approach that has to do with the fact that sound technology is developing in such a way that now we can make relatively high-resolution recordings, where in the past one needed to focus on some kind of signal rather than to sort of suppress the noise, if we want to take that kind of communications model. But now with very nice microphones, which have been available for a long time, but especially with digital recorders, which don't have the sort of background noise that tape had, we can focus more on the noise. We can focus more on recording noise in the environment, and I'm using the term just sort of metaphorically in terms of this relationship between signal and noise. There is not necessarily a clear signal anymore. There's lots of information in the environment all around us at all times, and this comes back to some of the concerns of documentary film video. If we consider that as a tool of anthropology, there was a lot of suspicion earlier on of the photographic image or of the moving image, specifically now speaking of within anthropology, because the goal of anthropology traditionally has been to sort of, the expert goes to, or somebody becomes an expert by going to some place and interacting with some people, and then transforming that experience into a written document which clearly explains in a way that can't be misinterpreted what this person's understanding is of whatever that was that they experienced. And in a written document, you can do that very easily. You can direct people's attention to specific details. You can leave out huge amounts of detail altogether. If, for example, there are lots of ethnographies of sort of simple society or small-scale societies where aspects of modernization, aspects of international trade were just left out of the picture altogether because they weren't part of the picture that the particular anthropologist wanted to put forward. So the idea that a photograph or a moving image contains too much information, you can't constrain your viewers or the experiencer's experience of it to the extent you can with a written document. There's lots of stuff happening in the background. There's little details in the corner. You can frame it, of course, in certain ways, but there's only so much you can do, and so it becomes much more about a sort of associative or it becomes less about denotation, more about connotation, and this ability of film, video, or photography to convey sort of the messiness of human life and the richness of our interactions with other people, of the ethnographer's interactions with the people that they're studying, and so forth. And so when we move then to sound only, there's even sort of arguably less ability to direct our attention to specific details. There's less information in the stream. And so that part of my interest in working with sound only then is, in a way, because that it becomes a sort of rich field for intellectual experience, because it's not directive in that sense, because it allows for sort of your associative faculties to sort of take over. You can drift in and out of attention. You can stop thinking about what things mean or don't mean. You can experience things simply as sounds can become musical sounds, or they can become representative sounds. A lot more kind of falls to the experiencer of it, rather than being there in the work itself necessarily. Now, I don't know if this piece is, having said all that, I don't know if this piece is, I don't know if I would call it an ethnographic work. As I think I said at the beginning, I think the idea of sonic ethnography is a sort of experimental proposal. Is it possible for sound only to convey ethnographic information? Stephen Feld, who's a major figure in anthropology of sound, and doing anthropology in sound, as he says, talks about acoustomology, the idea of sound as a way of knowing, combining obviously acoustic and epistemology. And so the idea is to use sound in order to explore notions of place, ideas of the way in which we experience place, and who knows. So I'll leave it at that, I guess. Suitably unclear introduction to what will be a hopefully very unclear experience. So this is a 55-minute piece. I just was able to present. This is the third time now I'm presenting this version of this iteration of this material. As I think Terry mentioned, this piece I presented at the Vienna Film Festival last year, and just in the middle of April, at a part of a great series that the Film Society of Lincoln Center was doing called Art of the Real, where they were exploring sort of what we might want to call expanded documentary, or sort of approaches to nonfiction film video that, maybe try to expand our notions of what documentary can be. And one night, and certain part of that program was devoted to works from the Sensory Ethnography Lab, including one evening of sound work, which was the main piece that we played. So, thanks. Oh, the other thing I was going to say, about sitting in the middle, right? So this is a 5.1 piece. I would recommend you sit in the middle, if possible, rather than over on the side, just for fun.
I just want to open by saying this is kind of an amazing experience of this room in a new way. Many of us know this room well, and you have taken us into a kind of architectural and landscape journeys far beyond what I could have expected this room to do.
Yeah, it's an interesting lesson too about the contingent sort of nature of sound. I mean, every room sounds different, and every sound system is different, which kind of reminds you that, or brings up the question of what kind of record of reality is sound in the first place, if that's the case, is there ever anything that one can really point to and say, yes, this is the sound, like I don't know if you noticed at the beginning, the low frequencies were really kind of overemphasized. So what we did, there's not a separate volume knob on the subwoofer, so we just switched it off, because it's a 5.1 mix with a, 0.1 means, okay.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Would it be better if I stood at the microphone?
If you don't mind.
Okay.
Good sound for the
So the 0.1 and 5.1 this is maybe, I don't know, this may be interesting, maybe not. But the 0.1, is the subwoofer channel. And I think what's going on with this system is that often what's going on with the subwoofer is it's both providing the low end for the main speakers and taking that 0.1, so that's a sixth channel of sound. And I was routing lots of sound to that subwoofer. And in the rooms I've heard this in so far, it's been about right, but this was too much. So we turned off the subwoofer channel, and then I turned up the rest of it to make up for it. But yeah, this question of what a sound recording is already a very kind of contingent record of something that may have happened in a particular place. There's a couple of ways of talking about the relationship of the recorded sound to the original, so-called original sound, like in musique concrète or acousmatic music. They talk about the acousmatic object, this thing where you've taken the sound and you're replaying it back in a different place from where it originally happened. Murray Schafer, who sort of coined the term soundscape, which is maybe relevant for the landscape workshop. Also coined the term, although he may not have actually coined the term soundscape, he seems to have popularized it. There's a graduate student that I was talking to at Harvard who was trying to pin down who coined that term, and she thinks actually Buckminster Fuller may have coined the term soundscape. But anyway, it's a kind of term that could have arisen simultaneously in different places, maybe. But Murray Schafer also coined the term schizophonia, and he used this term schizophrenia to talk about this very obviously worrisome aspect of a sound being ripped from its origin, and obviously he's playing on schizophrenia, and which it as this kind of frightening negative thing that happens when a recorded sound is taken out of context. But Murray Schafer also was. Just to give a thumbnail, so he wrote this book in 1977 called The Tuning of the World, in which he was concerned with this enterprise of acoustic ecology, and was concerned in this book, he's got sort of he's sort of reacting against modernity in general. I mean, he's interested in He's interested in the, our sense of well-being as determined by our sound, the soundscape in which we live, and for him, less noise is better, and no noise is perfect, and there's a lot to that, and a lot of work came out of the acoustic ecology movement, which, tried to regulate noise in the workplace, and places, is concerned about noise pollution, and places where noise is really a factor in people's well-being. But he's also criticized a lot for, not allowing for urban sounds to be meaningful sounds for people who live in cities, to experience those sounds as not just informational, but as enjoyable kinds of environments. But anyway, so where was I going with that? Schizophonia, acousmatic sound object, this idea that, that there is an original sound and that you can record it and then play back that sound in some other place. Well, the whole idea is a bit silly. And Jonathan Stern, who has this great book from 2003 called Audible Past, sort of points out that he takes up this idea, that has kind of been handed down to us, that a sound can be recorded and taken away from its place of origin and played back in another field or another place. And he points out that there is really that the act of recording itself sort of creates the original. There is no original sound without the act of recording, and that the sounds that we hear, or that the recording that's made, is dependent on all of these contingencies, that it's basically a kind of socially constructed situation to begin with, that even if we think of it in terms of physical space, there is no one sound that a thing makes. So if I'm in a cable car, there's a sound that I may have heard from a particular point of view within that place, but there's no sound of the cable car. That's an objectively existing thing. You create that sound by making the recording of it. And I approach recording that way. I think of moving with the microphones in a place as if I'm making the sound happen by putting the microphone capsules in a particular relationship with the place where I am or the situation that I'm in. And that itself becomes not only a creative act, but a kind of improvisational one, as one moves. In this case, I'm mostly in static kind of environments, although the environments themselves are moving. But in other kind of situations, it's, the act of recording is really an improvisational one in which that sound is, it's not a matter of finding a sound or capturing a sound. People often talk about capturing a sound. I really think it's much more an issue of creating that sound. Or creating a recording, which then becomes, it's not even a sound. We play it back in one room and it's a different sound than what we play back in some other room. So what is it really, Any questions? Yes?
I had a question. First of all, I thought that was beautiful, a great piece of work.
Thank you.
Very sort of thought-provoking. And I'm intrigued by your idea of the two pillars, one being sort of documentary and the other being electroacoustic music.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if when you're creating a piece of music like that, whether you have any sort of criteria, any sort of cardinal rules that you feel that you should not break unless under certain circumstances, mm-hmm. or whether there's a, kind of a, whether maybe different sound artists, clearly Murray Schafer has his own, his own sort of set of dogma or, ideology that
mm-hmm.
Sort of leads him to where his piece is going to end up. And just wondering whether you have, like, are there certain kinds of sound manipulation that you would avoid at all costs, or does anything go? Like I noticed some cool tuning things in the course of some of the drones that you had,
mm-hmm.
and some of the upper partials, which seemed like they were tuned. They were perfectly in tune. They seemed like they were things that came from different origins that were perfectly in tune.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering whether do you manipulate those things, or do you look for them
mm-hmm.
to work together,
mm-hmm.
or do you, is that a conscious or can you talk about your process that way?
Yeah, sure. So I don't really think of it in terms of dogma in the sense of like Dogma 96 or Dogma 97. I don't remember which year it is, but what is it?
95.
Is it 95? Okay, good. Thanks. Where the idea is, there are certain rules that are set, no, only natural light, only diegetic sound. So I don't think of it in terms of rules in that sense, but I do, I am interested in having a set of constraints and working within a set of constraints, and that sort of in distinction from the tradition that sort of came out of Simon Fraser University and Murray Schafer. It became, this tradition that's kind of known as soundscape composition, where people go into, a composer will go into an environment, have a kind of experience, and then take those recordings into the studio and craft in much more an acousmatic kind of way, a representation of their subjective experience of that place. I'm more interested in seeing what can be done with the recording itself as it was made, and pushing them and trying to capture something. Oh, again, see, I'm contradicting myself. Trying to create a sound in the act of recording that is an interesting sound, and that's actually very easy to do. I think that there's no need for manipulating or processing sounds in order to end up with a musically interesting result. And so in my pieces, I don't process the sounds actually in any way. I don't. Maybe there's some subtle EQing. Mostly it's kind of on the sort of mastering end. In terms of not blowing out the. Like in this case, I would have said that I mastered it poorly. I'm not blowing out the subwoofer, or making sure that the balance of frequencies is good, or applying a bit of limiting on the peaks or that kind of thing. But I don't. What you were hearing was basically in the material as I recorded it for the most part. There were a couple of points in that piece where there were two journeys overlaid on each other, and so there's a bit of combinatorial stuff happening there. Although I think for the most part in this version, and I'm trying to remember because certainly on the CD, it's the CD version. I made 3 different versions of pieces from this material. On the CD, each track is basically one journey, coming in at some point and exiting at some other point, with there being a sort of self-generated beginning, middle, and end from the recordings because of the way that the rides go. But I made an 8-channel piece where there's a lot of actually layering and of kind of moving around the space and so forth of two different rides or 2 different recordings might be overlaid. In this one, I think that all that's happening is maybe the beginning, and so if this is a sound recording from beginning to end, I may be doing this kind of layering of the same journey on itself in different channels, but not two different locations layered on top of each other. But the material is there's so many resonances and tones, and I think it makes sense that they would be even harmonics or, not even, but sort of a harmonic series that would make sense because it is this cable that's resonating, as you go up the mountainside. So that's there. And so, yeah, I don't think of it in terms of dogma, but I do think of it in terms of a useful set of constraints, and I'm interested in order to really feel like one can go back between these sort of different modes of listening. And I'm thinking of, like Michel Chion talks about these 3 modes of listening: causal, where you're listening for the cause, what made that sound, the cause of a sound; the semantic mode of listening, where you're listening, like with language, where you're listening for the meaning of words; and what he calls reduced listening, which is where you're not doing either of those 2 things, but you're just experiencing the sound as sound. And then the composer Francisco Lopez takes that, and he prefers the term profound listening because it's not reduced. He doesn't like to call it reduced listening. He likes to call it profound listening because you're really engaging with what he calls the sonic matter, or sound matter, sonic matter. But anyway, in order to really feel like you can move between those different kind of modes of listening, I think that's, once you start processing your sounds and creating musical sounds from what then becomes source material, I think you lose that ability to relate to what it was that originally made that sound. And I think we find that a lot in soundscape composition, and there's a whole genre of music where people make what they call field recordings and then process them in any number of ways using digital effects, and then it becomes very quickly it's sort of, to me, it's no longer of interest what the source of those sounds were. It seems like they could be generated by anything, or they could. A lot of times you might as well just stick your microphone out of the window to just generate some stimulus on the microphone, if then you're going to put it through a chain of digital sound effects. So I'm more interested in sort of taking advantage of the ability of sound of a microphone to evoke that original situation of the recording. Yeah.
Well, in that sense, would you want us to have a thoughtful experience of this?
A what?
A thoughtful experience of this?
I don't mind. What do you mean, though?
That's not really, well, because it seems more, if you're having a causal listening,
Yeah.
then you're listening for harmonics, you're listening for
Yeah.
sounds that you could have inserted, you're listening for the, and in that sense, you're not listening for the profoundness, effective level
Uh-huh.
of the sounds.
Yeah.
And so I just was curious about, because I was wondering,
I see what you
why-
mean. I see,
why
yeah.
why put percussion in this?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, because in certain ways it violates the,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So I just was curious about how you made those decisions.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. It is a good question. I don't know how you can constrain the kind of listening experience that an audience will have. You know, I think that
Turn up the subwoofer.
to obliterate any sense of reference, right? No, it's a bunch of issues there. Yeah.
Well, I gave it an unthoughtful listening. I really enjoyed it. So.
Yeah, unthoughtful or thoughtful?
Unthoughtful.
Unthoughtful.
At the effect. Of
Yeah. I fell asleep.
Completely.
Yeah. No, I think that, I mean, that's what sort of interests me, is the ability, though, to go back and forth between those. That it's, in this case, yeah, the question of why add music. I mean, it's similar to the question of why add music to your documentary movie, maybe, although not really. Right, because you can have a completely musical experience, which is, I think, what Xion and Francisco Lopez are talking about with this reduced listening, sort of, you know. Although I actually think it's impossible to have a completely profound listening experience, except maybe when one's asleep or nearly asleep, or in a profound state of having been an advanced meditator for 20 years, or I don't know. I think that's a lofty goal, I think, to have that kind of experience. And I think we do have that we are able to, one is able to enter into that kind of experience sometimes momentarily, but and maybe I'm just showing my not advanced state along the path of meditation, but one snaps out of it. One can't help but sort of have an association or think of what caused that sound, or even if it's not a conscious thing, you know, you hear a clang and you know that's some metal against metal. You can't, and again, just speaking for myself, I suppose, you can't just enter into the resonances of that sound without also hearing it as metal.
But
you
you
know.
can be aware of the effective flow that is prior to those kind of causal.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought,
Mm-hmm.
you know, your piece was very oriented toward that effective.
Mm-hmm.
And insofar as you're just registering that, you are listening in a profound sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You referred to your recordings as having a beginning and an end, and
Okay.
I was just wondering, what do you think of your pieces as having definitive beginnings and endings, or there are multiple entry and exit points, or is it an open structure? Is it a structure that is operated on the principle of a loop?
Mhm.
Because if you think of, let's say, Walter Ruttman's The Weekend, which
Mhm.
is a very different experience from yours, we should call it blind film.
Yeah.
There is there are definite entry and exit points, and it follows the Dawn to Dusk of the Symphony. And I was just, thinking maybe you could compare your piece to that of The Weekend.
Mhm.
If it stands in direct opposition to what you did, or, I mean, obviously you let your sounds unfold as opposed
Mhm.
to juxtaposing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that is a super important historical precedent, I think, for this kind of work. There are not many pieces like that, especially from that period. This was like 1920 27 or 31, or what was the?
Around 27. 27, I think, was the Berlin City Symphony.
Uh-huh.
So it was, I don't recall correctly whether
Mhm.
it was earlier or later.
Right, it's right around then. So yeah, for those of you in the room who might not be familiar, this piece Weekend by Walter Ruttmann, he made it with, I think, magnetic film stock, and which was sort of a clever idea because it was before tape, so it was before people were able to edit sound very easily. I mean, but he did it in this kind of clever way, which is also refers to film. Aside from that, there were sort of discs, and so if people wanted to edit sound from recordings, they were doing sort of disc-to-disc transfers until like 1940, like the late 40s. Pierre Schaeffer's first pieces were the first ones to take advantage of using tape in order to edit sound pieces. But I mean, that piece is only 10 or 11 minutes, and yeah, as you said, has in and out points. I think that I don't think of my process as in opposition to that at all, although this doesn't have the sort of very tidy organization of morning to evening kind of structure. But I do think of it as having a beginning, middle, and end. I did the 8-channel version of this that Helen and I did in collaboration, though, is considered more of a loop. I mean, it was made as an installation for one thing. So once something is just installed in a room and people are going to come and go, there's no beginning and end anymore that you can impose on the structure. That's kind of what's nice about a cinematic setting. If it's starting at a particular time, you experience it with in that way. But so I have made works that are loop based in a sense, but they're always long form. Like that one, that installation version is almost 70 minutes. This piece that Terry mentioned that we had at the MIT gallery called Hourly Directional Sound Recordings is a 4-channel piece it's more structural in its form, where it grows out of Helen's walking practice that I mentioned, and for this piece we were walking every day for 3 weeks. Not every day, but most days for 3 weeks, and so full day walks of 8 hours or so, and stopping every hour to make a 1-minute sound recording, and then at one point with microphones pointing in 4 directions, and at one point during that minute, Helen goes in the direction. So it's a little bit of a complicated setup, but I'll just try to say it quickly. So we orient the microphones towards north each time we stop. And then the path is going at a particular angle, from north. Helen goes a certain distance in that direction and rings the orchestral triangle that you also heard once in this piece. And so that's sort of the directional marker. And so it's just structured, and I could play a little bit of it if we wanted to, but it's structured in these 1-minute sections. So each day is 7 minutes long. The triangle comes towards the beginning of the minute, the first hour, and then a little bit later in the minute, each subsequent hour. And that piece too, there is a structure to it, but there's not necessarily any beginning or end. You can come in during any part of it, and it doesn't really matter. But pieces that I make that are more what we might call music and are not installation pieces, which is the majority, I think of as having beginnings and ends, and try to structure them in some way. It's nice when there is something like this structure. I mean, a day structure is a very tidy structure, and it's tempting to work with that kind of organization. But I recently did this piece, Single Stream, that Terry mentioned too, which is an audio-video piece. Takes place in a so-called materials recovery facility. This place where they bring all of your recyclables. I don't know if you have that here, where you can put all your recyclables in the same bin, or do you have to put like glass with glass and metal with metal here on campus? It's all together. Yeah. So there's a place where all that has to get separated out again, of course, and it's a vast operation, and there's tons of fancy machines, that use all different kinds of technology for separating the metal out and for, shining a light on the plastics to see which is what kind, and a blast of air tosses it from one conveyor belt to another, and all these kinds of things. And for that, we did incorporate a kind of structure that was given to us by the place, where basically we started at the front of the facility, with the material dumped in huge heaps and being pushed by front loaders, and then following different pathways as it moved through this vast network of conveyor belts until you're at the end, where it's compressed into these neat cubes and being loaded on the trucks. So that's a similar kind of tidy structure.
The weekend was 1930.
1930, okay, great.
I wanted to ask a question that might take us to landscape and maybe other places.
Mm-hmm.
I was struck at a certain point in the unfolding of this piece by just that kind of haptic and tactile and proprioceptive aspects that are activated
Mm-hmm.
by the sound. And it was remarkable that this, when you think about this as the soundscape of this landscape, that most of us kind of first call to mind in images of Sound of Music or something like that,
Sound of Music.
It's really quite, jarring to realize that this, in fact, is the soundscape of that.
Yeah.
So much of your experience of that landscape as a day-to-day experience in, Swiss transport systems.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this kind of reconfigured relationship to the landscape because of the machinery that basically, replaces the physical effort of climbing, ascending and descending these
Mm-hmm.
topographies. And that kind of led me, you certainly inspired associates to thinking about an essay by Erkki Huhtamäki where he talks about amusement parks and the emergence of amusement park rides as a kind of reconfigured relationship of the laborer to the machinery of labor. And so it's just kind of remarkable to me to think about this as a way of accessing or thinking about a kind of history of the body in relationship to machinery that as at the level of the tactile and which is acoustic,
Mhm.
of course, and proprioceptive and kinesthetic. And there's something, and maybe in a lot of your work, that kind of touches on that, the walking pieces as well. This kind of marking or positioning of the body, almost like an echolocation of a sort, right?
Mm-hmm.
I really found myself kind of in this blurred space between whether I was the trolley or the cable car,
Mm-hmm.
the gondola, the train, or whether it was me rocked and vibrated by that,
Yeah.
and the sound, which is all a part of that same spectrum, really, if you think of it that way. There's kind of laboring that you feel
Mhm.
that cuts across the machine and the body. I don't know, it was just, to me, I don't know where that sits, right?
Yeah.
It kind of goes back to something that Roy was talking about. I don't think there is a kind of prelingual, like I can't understand the
Right.
sound without knowing a lot of associations or leaping to causal ways of listening, let's say. But then there's this other level on which you're just like vibrating a body and a
Mhm.
space, and my relationship to this space and that space through this kind of combination. And there's something in that I don't think we have a lot of language. We don't have a lot of writing about that,
Mhm.
or a lot of ways of recording that in order to reflectively, look back on a data set and
Mhm.
draw
Yeah.
conclusions.
Yeah, I think there's maybe more kind of critical thinking about those relationships in terms of film, but less so with when you subtract the image, although maybe a lot of it would still apply, in terms of thinking about the positioning of the. But it's more of a physical, as you said, you're sort of resonating with, rather than being a viewer of, So it is, yeah, it is more about the kinesthetic and even proprioceptive kind of senses. Yeah.
I guess my question is related to the academic landscape in terms of where sound is listened to, whether that's a classical music program, a communications department, visual studies or art department, or a media department. It seems like you alluded a little bit just in the last comment to that there's less discourse, and I don't think that that's accidental. I think that there is a provision of sight that's occurred, and that there's a lot of space, especially in U.S. Academies, to listen to sound and to talk about it. I mean, I think in England there's Sonic Arts, which maybe takes care of some of these kinds of considerations. So I guess maybe I'm asking to hear a little more about the program at Harvard, and then maybe your take on why there's less attention paid to it, or if there's a developing interest.
I think there definitely is a developing interest, and yeah, like so with where to start? I mean, yeah, I think there are a lot of historical reasons why sound is less developed as a field. I mean, there's just it hasn't. People who are interested in kind of investigating representation gravitate more towards film and video for obvious reasons. Historically it would be film, of course, which obviously includes a sonic component. I mean, Rootman's Weekend is really one of the exceptions. It's surprising how few pieces there are like that, if you look over the history. I mean, but yeah, I mean, so in my class that I'm teaching now called Sonic Ethnography, it's a practice-oriented class. It's not a sort of sound study. Sound studies itself is really blowing up right now, it seems like. It's sort of this interdiscipline of people who are interested in sound, not necessarily for its own sake, but by looking at issues of sound or the history of sound technology or different aspects of sonic practices, whether it's the exchange of cassette tapes and different places or any number of issues. It's a way of getting into interesting issues, cultural or history of technology, any kind of issues. So sound as an entry point, realizing that it's fruitful in that way. But in terms of the practice of making sound works that are existing in a similar context with maybe documentary, film, and video. So I have a number of readings that I assign in the class, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of good writing on the topic. When I'm interested specifically in writing that's about this practice of sound recording, that'll help think about what it is we're actually doing when we're recording and editing and so forth. So there's a lot when it has to do with film and video and documentary. David McDougall's a good example of somebody who writes beautifully about different things that are involved in nonfiction filmmaking. And there's a fair amount of writing about acousmatic music or electroacoustic composition, but in the sort of fields that are related to acoustic ecology or soundscape composition, kind of places where you might look for some crossover in terms of trying to theorize about what it is to listen to documentary sound. Yeah, there's very little. There's a review article in the Annual Review of Anthropology from, is it 2011 or 12? I think it's 11, which was sort of like towards a sounded anthropology, and they're trying, talking about the ways in which anthropology should make use of sound recordings or could make use of it. But it's written, again, this other trap that people fall into is this article in an anthropology journal talking about bringing sound into anthropology in terms of this practical sense of working with tape recorders, which Stephen Feld has been talking about for a long time now, is written by it's co-written by 3 or 4 ethnomusicologists, and they fall into this trap of talking about sound in this context or urban sound in that context, and then a list of citations, and then you look at their list of citations, all of them are only about musical sound. And so it becomes this kind of code word for ethnomusicologists who are trying, it seems like they're talking about non-musical sound or, environmental sound and so forth, but yeah, they're not, So I don't know why it's taking a long time, basically, for it to be a more talked about critical field. I mean, partially because there's not a lot of people working in it,
I wonder if it exposes the bias of the research universities that develops out of Europe in the 1500s, where the oral shifts to the written with the technology of print, of course, but that writing is a visual form in a sense.
I think there's something to that, and I think there's something to, there's also, we have, it's this sort of, we're used to watching movies and to well, what do I want to say? I mean, I was going to say, if you try to present, sound work in an academic conference and so forth, then you immediately realize it's not going to work, because unless you make a lot of specifications in advance, because you go to your normal conference and it's maybe this kind of sound system with speakers in the ceiling, and so I mean it's just not going to be an experience that anyone is going to want to have. I was at one conference where somebody had their laptop. They were trying to play back a sound, and so they took the microphone and bent it over their laptop speaker in order to get the, it's like, okay, no wonder nobody's going to take sound seriously if that's what it's about. So there's that practical issue, and you could say that that's rooted in this sort of orientation towards sight. But the technology, it's much easier to look. We can look at a photograph, we can look at a moving image even, and we can agree on what's in it, just on that basic level. But if we listen to a sound recording, we're not necessarily going to all hear the same thing or agree on what's in there. It's just not. It's not a sort of objectively existing thing, as I was kind of trying to talk about earlier.
Because it can't be objectified, it's not paid attention to.
Maybe, yeah. It's difficult to talk about. And actually in that review article, and this was, I don't know why I pick on these guys because they're well-meaning, but they bring up an example of, one of the only examples they bring up of sort of location recording-based work is, or they bring up two examples, Christopher De Laurenti and Ania Lockwood. So Christopher De Laurenti has made recordings of the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999 and different kinds of, and from that he ended up going to a lot of other kind of protest kind of situations and making sound pieces, wearing microphones next to his ears to create kind of a realistic image, especially when listened back on headphones. And so they bring up Christopher De Laurenti and they say, although his pieces are really rely on this subjective point of view, it's like, and they sort of dismiss it that way, which is this completely bizarre coming in an anthropological journal where, as people have been talking about for at least 30 years in anthropology, that it's all about this subjective encounter between the ethnographer and their subjects. That there is no knowledge that doesn't come out of that subjective encounter. So anyway, it's just kind of weird why these things aren't kind of catching on more. Yeah.
That will be our last question, Sarah.
Oh, well, an anecdote and then a quick question. What you talked about, the ethnomusicologist article, just reminded me of when I first was for those of you who don't know me, I'm an ethnographic filmmaker, and I decided to give my expensive Nagra to people on this island off the coast of Alaska where I was filming. And I had just come out of film school at MIT, and I was very nervous to give this expensive. So I gave it away, and I gave it to some of the hunters, and I showed them how to use it, and it was quite advanced technology, and I gave them a couple of different microphones, and very quickly told them what the different microphones do. And I said, go take sound. Because I hadn't thought of it until you were talking about the ethnomusicologist looking for music, but I wasn't looking for music. And they came back with the most extraordinary sound, better than any of my colleagues in film school. With 2 hours of prep. That's all I gave them. The sound was just amazing what they came for. And I all of a sudden realized that I had been deaf all my life, really, in our culture. And so, to your question, I mean, I think it is obviously very much what we hear is what we know to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really taught me so much about, people are aware of the images that we get are subjective, but the sound was extraordinary. And I did incorporate their sound, and I turned, when we were filming things where women weren't supposed to be, I gave them the camera, so they did record for some of my early films. So that was one anecdote. And the other question I had was, when I was learning how to do recording, but more how to mix and prepare for mixes, I entered into this world of it was a fiction world because that's where you mix in New York or California, whereas everyone was used to fiction films, but documentaries, they would tolerate you and sometimes give you a break on the cost.
Right.
It's like, $10,000, $20,000 for an hour, 90-minute film for a sound mix. Students here probably don't realize that.
I need to raise my prices.
But the whole culture of sound cutters and assistant sound cutters and mixers and everything else was invisible to our culture. And it still is in many ways. It's invisible, and that's when I started knowing people who would call me up in the middle of the night to let me listen to a phone, on their phone to a sound out the window, because they're like, God, you've got to listen to this sound. And they all talk to each other to this day, and now Terry and you and all kinds of other people are doing these things. But it has been kind of a hidden society of people who fetishize sound. I was lucky to enter into, but I do wonder in terms of that kind of sound sculpting, how you think of it as different now for your work. I mean, I know you mix films, and so you slide between the two areas.
How I think of what is different?
Soundscapes and mixing for film.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, that's a big issue because, I mean, obviously when you're working with image, that sets a number of constraints, but also opens up other possibilities at the same time. So, you're constrained by sort of having to make something that makes sense with what you're seeing on the screen. But then it also gives you ideas for how you might augment what's happening on the screen, or contradict what's happening on the screen, or what's happening off of the screen, or those kinds of issues. Yeah, I don't even know where to. It depends on the project, of course, but.
Specifically, we talk about Sweetgrass or Leviathan because
Uh-huh.
I know that many of our students here
Oh.
watched either or both.
Oh, great.
So maybe some about
Oh, okay.
about some of the challenges of marrying sound and picture and still trying to apply the principles of the sensory ethnography
Mhm.
both layers.
Those were two really different projects to work on sound for. One of the notable things about, at least for me, about working on Sweetgrass was, it's similar to actually similar in some ways with Leviathan, but in terms of situating the human actors in the broader landscape and in the sort of community of other creatures which are on screen. And for that movie, in contrast to Leviathan, in certain ways, the sound was well recorded. So a lot of the cowboys were wearing, they're wearing lavalier microphones, like I am, and so we had their voices very clearly on tape, and had the ability to have them stand out. But in many cases, a choice was made to not to allow their voices to stand out. So if they're sharing the screen with horses and sheep and so forth, to not privilege the human voice over the animal voices. So in that sense, the sound is helping to kind of create relationships between the different characters on screen. Although with, so Sweetgrass was, I felt that it was mixed in the most kind of straightforward way possible, with the exception of that kind of thing, which was initially hard for me as somebody who, cares about well-recorded sound, to like not allow the voices to stand out and be crisp and clear. The effort there was really to use the sound recordings that Lucian had made on location to create as immersive and realistic a situation as possible. And that involved, because a lot of his recordings, all of his recordings were mono. They were either recorded with an on-camera microphone and one wireless lav, or sometimes just with two wireless lavs, or sometimes just with one mono microphone on the camera. And from those, to create first a stereo and then a surround sort of environment, did end up requiring a lot of layering and finding other kinds of recordings from similar events, like especially with the scenes where there are a lot of sheep. I like what we call the sheep wreck scene in particular, where they're trying to get up the mountain and there's some kind of bottleneck and they're caught and they're communicating with each other on radios, and the sheep are kind of stymied, but then they start kind of stampeding, and that required that in that sequence the sound really carries a lot of sort of the narrative, so to speak, of what's happening at that moment, with the voices on the radio and the voices of the people who are on screen, but also we used lots of different layers of sheep recordings, that are happening in different places in the stereo field in order to kind of create that. And sort of similarly with Leviathan, it's a highly constructed, so Sweetgrass doesn't seem like a highly constructed soundtrack, but it really is in a lot of ways. Whereas Leviathan, I think it seems like a highly constructed soundtrack, and it is. And with that movie, or film, as we might say, I like this word film because, the trouble with film is that it refers to celluloid, and so it's weird to talk about a film when it was shot on video and we're seeing it projected on video and so forth. Anyway, but video, you can't call it a video either. So that one was shot, using these GoPro, sport POV cameras, as they're called, I think. And the sound, of course, was recorded then on a little mono microphone that's built into this camera, which is then encased in plastic to make it waterproof, and then it's like tied onto the end of a pole or something like that. And so the sound of those cameras ended up being kind of amazing, and in this kind of electroacoustic gift in a lot of ways, because they don't react in ways that you would expect them to. There's lots of resonances from the ship's engines that kind of come through and resonate weirdly. I don't know if it has to do with that plastic casing or what it is, but we did use a lot of that as to create a sort of ongoing sound, but then also constructed a believable soundtrack on top of that. So using that sync sound, we also layered that then with recordings that they had made on the boat using good stereo microphones and other cameras, because the intention in the first place wasn't to record the whole movie using GoPros. They had used other video cameras and tried to record, more traditional images and traditional sound. And they'd also gone around the boat recording sound just with a stereo microphone and sound recorder, And because labor is repetitive, you get similar kinds of sounds, each day when you make recordings. And so then we would find recordings that contain the sound of the winch pulling up the net, or recordings that contain chains clanking, or recordings that contain these other kinds of sounds of labor, and identifying sync points and really constructing the soundtrack with a lot of these layers of location sound. So yeah, similarly becomes highly constructed, but with an eye towards both realism and taking advantage of this totally weird electroacoustic sound of the GoPro microphones. I think I've maybe veered away from the question, and also maybe we're running out of time.
We are.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much, Ernst, and I want to thank you all for attending. This was really a fascinating presentation,
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.